Someone else will do it in a different manner.
I'm not going to do that.
Okay.
He memorized his, and I guess you guys want to try it.
Okay, so we're going to get started. Welcome to our second debate, week 2. We're going to discuss semiotics and architecture. I want to clarify some of the selection criteria. So before you answer the question, which position are you in now? Let's go over what that means, which position is which people are arguing for which position and how to think about this. But before we start, just as a preliminary, I want to review the statement up for debate. So this week, we're arguing whether semiotics is or is not a valid approach to design, because architecture does or does not operate as a text or language of form. So the current statement is that semiotics is not a valid approach to design, because architecture does not operate as a text or language of form. So what does this mean, and what are the historical terms of this debate? During the 1960s and 70s, architecture was in the midst of what was called the autonomy debates. And autonomy literally meant arguing or thinking about what made architecture different or autonomous from other things. So for Eisenman and the realm of design, this is different from serving humans and human beings and human needs. In the disciplinary realm, this meant what makes architecture different from poetry, from literature, from the fine arts, from philosophy. So what makes it a unique design medium in and of itself? So while some critics recognize that historical debates have referred to architecture as a language of form, ever since the Renaissance, if not before, many encourage people to think of and to examine architecture as a medium without presuppositions. What if we didn't assume that architecture was a language of form? Then what is constitutive of that medium? What makes architecture different from other mediums? So in order to choose a position today, you must decide what the ultimate purpose of language is, and whether or not architecture also fulfills these characteristics, right? So if architecture is a language of form, then it has to somehow be similar to language. And so some of the questions you might think about is, if languages are meant to clearly communicate meaning, does architecture do this? Is the job of architecture to communicate meaning, therefore it operates as a language? If languages are primarily instead systems of grammar, so they set the rules for discussion and understanding meaning, then does this adequately describe the process of design? And is it possible that architecture used to function as a language, but does not anymore? Sort of piggybacking onto Eisenman's post-humanist debates, that there was a humanist discussion that meant that architecture worked as a language. Now that we're in a post-humanist phase, it no longer does. Or is it always and forever a language of form? Just some preliminaries. And just so we don't get confused on who is arguing the affirmative and who is arguing the negative, the affirmative side in this case is that semiotics is an appropriate metaphor for architectural design. The two people who will be arguing that are Barber and Glen on this side. So you see these guys, that's the affirmative side. Those who are arguing for the negative, semiotics is not an appropriate metaphor for architectural design, are Calum Dodson, Michael Paul James. They are on this side. And they've automatically sat on opposite sides, so it's kind of easy to figure out who is who. So right now you have to decide for yourself whether you think semiotics is an appropriate metaphor for architectural design, that architecture does operate as a language of form. If you believe that, you should check off the affirmative. If instead you believe that semiotics is not an appropriate metaphor for architectural design, because architecture does not operate as a language of form, then you should mark off the negative. Is that clear? Yeah? So now we know who's arguing for the affirmative, who's arguing for the negative. Yes? So just for the next 30 seconds or so, as you answer which side you're on currently, this is a statement up for debate. Semiotics is not a valid approach to design because architecture does not operate as a text or language of form. Do we have any extras? Okay. Can we pass those over so that the people who don't have any have them?
Is it pronounced Renaissance or Renaissance?
I think you're pronouncing it. You want to sound more literary and culture, you can say Renaissance. It doesn't matter. People
Say either way or either way.
Okay. So at this point in time, we're going to write the affirmative up. They're going to load their PowerPoint, and they're going to give their opening statement. I'm going to time them so that they have 5 minutes, and then we'll move to the negative side. We'll start whenever you guys are ready. Start the timer.
Semiotics and architecture. Humans live in an extraordinarily complex world of made objects. In any given environment, the array of co-present objects exists as components in a variety of interrelated sign systems. Each system addresses partly unique and partly redundant functions. It is characteristically the case that the same object formation will have varying meanings and behavioral associations in different contexts, or even within the same context at different times. For example, what is the act of scaling? Is it using a measuring device? Is it adjusting proportional relationships? Or is it climbing a vertical surface? A great difficulty arises when we attempt to understand the origin of these complexities and how they came to inform and engender our individual and collaborative lives amongst this world of objects. These objects are not merely a creation of our own, but in fact have shaped and shifted our species. These objects have become a point of dependence. As well as we depend on the world of sign formations, or as Alan Preziosi explains, human evolution is in part the product of our long interaction with systems of built forms. There has not been a single human society that did not artifactually reorder their environment without employing environmental formations, as what Pierce described by using sign tokens. Every society has communicated architectonically. And that is, every society has in some way, either knowingly or unintentionally, configured an enclosure that communicated information about them. Architecture is always already an ensemble of theory and history. It is a passage. The point here is that history is present or embodied in art instead of being merely the phenomenon or the condition that generates art without appearing. That is, art is not just a trace of history, but itself a mode of history. We experience history through one of its modes called art, as Michael Kelly has brilliantly written. Viewing the language of architecture is an attempt to see humanity, and in doing so are the full implications of built form available to us. Semiotics, simply defined, is the study of signs. As we discussed in class, this concept is founded on the two explanations made by Ferdinand de Saussure and his invariable rules of language, which were termed semiology, and also Charles Sanders Peirce's logical study of language called semiotics. Peirce intended to be a science studying all cultural phenomena as if they were systems of signs, on the hypothesis that cultural phenomena are, in reality, systems of signs or communication. Charles Morris elaborated on this concept by looking at it in terms of syntactics, semantics, and pragmatics. Syntactics is the relations of signs to one another in abstraction from the relations of signs to objects or interpreters. Semantics deals with the relation of signs to their designated, and so to the objects which they may or do denote. Pragmatics considers the relation of signs to their interpreters. Essentially, syntactics is about form, semantics is about meaning, and pragmatics is about use. Morris also describes indexical signs, icons, and symbols, which are used respectively to point or indicate meaning, exhibit properties of their referring content, and are arbitrarily or culturally assigned established signs. Semiotics is inherent in architecture as it communicates to us in different ways. Columns are similar to indexical signs, as their structure use is understood when views. Icons could be seen through facades or veneers. Symbols could include a steeple on a church, or popular symbols such as the McDonald's golden arches. The system of sign tokens is a reflexive system in which meaning can be seen in individual components such as words, as well as composition of meanings that structure a sentence, or build space. Umberto Eco, in his critical essay, Function and Sign, The Semiotics of Architecture, provides us with an analogy of the human discovery of the cave. In this constructed scenario, as humans find a cave, they begin to see the benefits of its function and use. At another instance, a second cave is located and examined. The humans begin to compare the two caves and assess the benefits of either. At another time, a third cave is found and a type is created. Even though the function of the cave was first assessed, the cave denoted the difference between open and closed space. The model or concept functions so well that he can now recognize from a distance someone else's cave, independently of whether or not he wants to take shelter in it. The man has learned that the cave can assume various appearances. The model is already codified, not yet on a social level, but on the level of this individual who proposes and communicates it to himself within his own mind. And he would be able, at this point, to communicate the model of the cave to other men by means of graphic signs. The architectural code would generate an iconic code, and the cave principle would become an object of communicated intercourse. At this point, the drawing of the cave, or the image of the cave in the distance, becomes communication of a possible function, and such it remains even when there is neither fulfillment of the function nor a wish to fulfill it. What has happened then is what Roland Barthes is speaking about when he says, as soon as there is a society, every usage is converted into a sign of itself. It is not difficult to see then the significance of the cave within the cella, the strength of the tree in the column, or the safety of shelter in the entrance. Now, what do you think of when you see these images? An interesting piece of semiotics as a study of signs is that communication does not have to be explicit, but pieces can be used to communicate a whole. In an image above, the apple and the numeric value of pi together make a sync of apple pie, although neither are the actual object that is implied. In architecture, different elements are combined and communicate a variety of meanings depending on culture and individual experience. And that in their design, buildings will inherently communicate to the observer. This message may be one of stability and strength, or it could also be one of adaptation and flexibility. In conclusion, communication is inherent in architecture, and as such, the implementation of semiotic analysis opens a full breadth of architectural semiotic analysis, opens a full breadth of architectural expression to the architect, and thus is necessary in any concerted effort to speak rather than to babble. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll listen to the negative signs, give their opening statements, and then we'll have a discussion about the two different positions.
Wikipedia defines semiotics as the study of meaning-making, the study of sign processes, and meaningful communication. The agreement on semiotics stops there, at the study of signs. Semiologists have yet to agree on or define a critical practice, method, or scope. I found it difficult to criticize semiotics, which remains in an ever-evolving state, refusing to disclose its true nature. Daniel Chandler, in his books on semiotics, asserts that semiotic analysis is little more than a pretentious form of literary criticism, applied beyond the bounds of literature and based merely on subjective and grand assertions. The kind of abuse has earned semiotics as an unenviable reputation, in some quarters as the last refuge for academic charlatans.
Semioticians often disagree on others' interpretations, vying for what has been called the elite interpreter. Edward McWorry and David Glen Mick in On Resonance, a critical pluralistic inquiry into advertising rhetoric, point out that structuralists in particular don't allow alternative interpretations, declaring that they represent the general consensus and need no critical validation. Although Colin Rowe points out the similarities in architecture in the ideal villa, his analysis cannot be validated via an extended random sample. Seeking out similarities and ignoring outliers has become the norm. Thus, semiotics, after nearly 100 years, has yet to produce an underlying universal structure for language nor arts.
Charles Jinks presented his ideas at the Symptoms Design Conference in Italy. He coined the term archisemiotics. Yet the general consensus from my readings is that it failed to determine the meaning of architectural scientifically. In fact, I have failed to find a verifiable, definable architectural language structure provided by semioticians whose argument is not just short of a parent saying, "because I said so." Architects have often used science as a shield to ward off critics, yet architecture remains recognized as an art. Its study relies less on science than it does representation. The stripping away of ornament in the modernist period in the name of science, as they chanted form follows function, left the viewer wanting. This derailment of architectural culture ostracized its users, as architects convinced each other that their architecture would better mankind.
This is not to say that semiotics is invalid. It is a very useful tool for critical analysis. As a means for design, it falls short as it relies on a posteriori knowledge. To take a synchronic interpretation has the advantage of stopping time and considering the reactions from society, politics, race, religion, etc. Many of those meanings are not discovered during their time, as the true nature of a symbol can remain hidden for days, months, years, decades, and even centuries. Theories can be developed on the failures and successes of a given project, possibly influencing future projects, but semiotics has yet to decipher a language of architecture. If a universal architectural language existed, architects would no longer be creators, but interpreters. In attempting to understand the meaning of a thing in a multicultural world, to understand the racial prejudices in China and differentiate those interpretations from racial prejudices in India, to not only consider the differences between religions, but also the nuances of its sects, to consider the political context of not only the country, but the state, the county, the city, and the neighborhood, to consider age, gender, size, and numerous other factors influencing an individual's interpretation. Social semiotics has a myriad of influences and would require gross generalizations or infinite research. It would require that architects would have the power of a god. Since the latter isn't possible, we are subject to summing it up. Those readings will fall victim to stereotypes and often an interpretation from the dominant class.
Dominic Strinati, in an introduction to theories on popular culture, wrote, "How can we know that a bunch of roses signify passion unless we know the intention of the sender and the reaction of the receiver, and the kind of relationship they are involved in? If they are lovers and accept the conventions of giving and receiving as an aspect of romantic sexual love, then we might accept this interpretation. But if we do this, we do so on the basis not of the sign, but of the social relationships in which we locate the sign. The roses may also be sent as a joke, an insult, a sign of gratitude, and so on. They may indicate passion on the part of the sender, but repulsion on the part of the receiver. They may signify family relationships between grandparents and grandchildren, rather than relations between lovers, and so on. They might even connote sexual harassment."
Semiotics could possibly produce a code for design, but that code has yet to be presented. Through an analysis of past projects, that code could be discovered, but it will unlikely be discovered through the blind faith of its followers. To build a metaphorical rose is to understand the receiver can derive nearly any meaning imaginable. The assumptions required to design via archisemiotics only provide a false assurance to the architect, who must use faith to hope for the intended meaning to be received. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, yeah, so now we're going to have both sides stand in front of the audience and entertain questions. And I'm going to take a stab at trying to summarize what it is that each side said. So on the affirmative side, that architecture is a set of signs, and therefore semiotics is an appropriate approach to design. What we heard is that over the course of time, because semiotics, or because architecture rather, is not just a phenomenon, but a historical mode of communication, that certain sets of signs accrue over time, and therefore there's a kind of communication that starts to occur automatically or organically from within societies. And on the other side, I remember hearing that one, that semiotics is kind of a shield, a scientific shield that critics have used in the post-war period to make themselves seem scientific or seem more authoritative than before. And secondarily, that even from a semiotic standpoint, that the indeterminacy of signs may suggest that architecture is not in fact a sign system. that the fact that we can look at a sign, but it can mean 2 or 3 or 4 different things, that it might suggest that the essence of architecture is somehow different. I don't know if I've sort of captured all of the nuances, so we're going to open it up to questions. But before that, we're going to give you guys an opportunity to maybe summarize your argument in 1 or 2 sentences for the audience before they can ask you some questions. So on the affirmative side, can you give us just a brief summary of what the main points of your argument is, how you'd like for us to remember what it is that you argue for?
That semiotics in architecture is and should be an examination of the base rather than the superficial facade. That it needs to be examined in depth and read as a whole in an attempt to understand where it is that humanity has come from and where it might be possibly going.
Okay, the negative.
Architectural semiotics may have been relevant in a culture that had a definable criteria. But in a multicultural world, he gave the example of the word scale and gave all the definitions of scale. You take each one of those words and translate them into another language. Now they relate to a whole other set of words. So it's not 3 or 4 possible explanations. It's 3 or 4, maybe million explanations, depending on what religion, what language, and so that's why jokes don't translate. So these multiple definitions of signs, if you're in New York and there are thousands of languages walking through the city, how are they possibly supposed to interpret the architecture in the way it was intended, unless the architect speaks all those languages?
So then on the negative side then, would you say then that semiotics assumes that the architect's job is to create a message to communicate to the public? That if we think of architecture as a sign system, that the only reason for that is because we want to communicate things to the public. And since we can no longer do that in a determinate fashion, that we should not think of architecture as a semiotic phenomenon.
I would say more that architecture is not a language, that it is subject to human interpretation and itself can't dictate the language. For example, in China, back in the day, red represents progress in China. And, what's her name? The Prime Minister, I think her name was Mao, decided she wanted to change the red-green light scenario and make red the go. Of course it didn't take. Because even though they tried to dictate what it should mean, you can't. Human language is too uncontrollable. And I don't think it can be controlled, and so therefore architecture is subject to human interpretation. It can't control it.
And what about the affirmative side? Do you think that the metaphor of architecture as a language or form, do you think that that is something that is fundamental to the medium, or is it something that emerged historically, let's say around the Renaissance period, so that we can understand what architecture does in society?
I feel like semiotics is inherent in architecture. Regardless of the meaning that communicates, it does in fact communicate. And I don't think that it is possible to communicate the same thing to every single person in the world. But I think that at its core, architecture does communicate. We talked about how it communicated at different times, different contexts. But the goal of architecture is to, or one of the uses of architecture is to communicate with those that are interpreting it. Not that it has to have the same meaning for every single situation, but inherently, because of our understanding, both historically and where we are today, I think that semiotics is inherent in architecture.
It forcibly makes the viewer have to examine not only structure, but also the context in which that structure was created, as well as in the context in which it's being read. So yes, it does have a complex structure and system that needs to be evaluated, but that does not mean that we can superficially look at the facade of something and give it a general reading or a universal. The only universal is that it speaks to humanity as a whole.
So what I'm hearing is that on the affirmative side, that when you talk about architecture as a language communicating something, you're not saying that it's communicating a deterministic meaning of how one must read the symbolic importance of this form. You're saying that it structures a kind of communication between space, place, context, that it structures our experience and understanding of a location, and therefore, as long as it's doing that, then it's doing what it's supposed to do as a language.
Exactly. It's as Roland Barthes talks about the referent, the the archive of the system, and how those things have to work in conjunction with one another. They refer to not only the context in which they were created, but also by the author or the reader themselves. How that message left the author itself, but then is read and interpreted by the reader, which then becomes an author in their own. So it has to be examined in both the context of its creation as well as the context of the reader itself.
So then for people who like want to use a Greek entablature impediment with columns to communicate solidity for a bank, are they misreading the purposes of what architecture is supposed to do as a language?
I guess that's a possibility if perhaps they're doing it only on a superficial level without actually examining the origins of those things. We have to be critical as designers of what it is that we're doing and not just take them for the broadest, most encyclopedia type definition of a style or form.
And would the negative want to respond to any of those assertions? Do you agree with these guys? Do you disagree? I mean, how are you coming out in terms of this thinking?
I would like to take it on, I guess, 3 points. My primary first is to start off, the tree falls in the woods, do you hear it? If a cave is unrecognizable, is it no longer architecture? If one person knows about it and hasn't talked about it, if it's not communicating a language or no one's even aware that it exists, does it cease to be architecture? So the question is does the language of architecture interpret itself, or do we force interpretation on it? And what I'm saying is that if I put this bottle on here, I could have done that randomly. I could have made a point with that. Or I could have just been unconsciously sticking it there. So some people might say, oh, he's thirsty. Some people might force some interpretation on it. But that doesn't mean that bottle was trying to communicate anything at all. It just is. And it exists. And human forces interpretation on everything. So therefore, if someone sits under something that prevents the rain from hitting them, is that architecture or not architecture? It doesn't matter. Architecture is, and we apply meaning to it. Second point is how rapid interpretations change. Twin Towers was a symbol of the power of New York, of how commerce and capitalism can create these massive structures without public money. After the bombing, it represented something very different. So within television and media, you know how quickly slang terms go in and out of favor. The same way, if you design with the idea of you understand this language, I think you're setting yourself up for failure.
So how do you design?
How do you design? Well, I think you design on your human experience. I think the integrity of design has to do with your experience, your interpretation.
So don't you think we are based on language, whether it's words, whether it's images, whether it's like sign language? I mean, people have been communicating through different kinds of signs ever since they existed.
We're saying architecture can't be categorized as a structured language because
Is it not an expression?
Do trees, is a tree growth, is that a language? Or a trees
But
just is?
That is something that is given, like we have not created the tree, it is like nature.
That is not true. There's very few trees that have been modified in some way by our ability to use science,
Okay.
use gardening,
Yes,
use whatever.
but
We
if
have
you're
hybrids
using-
and all
yes,
kinds of things.
but that's like, when you're using, now you're putting language into it, whether it's trimmed, whether you're using bushes that are more like organic and free-flowing in nature and form.
I think what happens
That's
is
fine.
when we examine the complexity of systems, often it's easy to disregard the system as too complex and throw it out, you know, the baby in the bathwater altogether. And that's not necessarily the case. Like I said, we need to critically engage these items, these issues, and apply them in an appropriate manner that we see fit for our context and our time, in an attempt to convey something to future time.
We can use architecture as a tool to communicate, but architecture itself is not a language. Just as neither is tree a language, or grass a language, or a rock on the ground a language. These are objects, we're forcing meaning onto it. It itself is not a language. That language exists in our head.
So are you creating a separation between the materiality of architecture, like kind of materialist interpretation of it as a thing? It's a static thing, it distributes weight in a particular way, it carries water, and that's what its literal function is in society. And then there's a kind of symbolic dimension, which may not be a product of the architecture, but maybe a product of the person or the society or something else. And so by making a distinction between these things, generally like what people would make a distinction between building and architecture, you're actually saying that architecture in that traditional sense is the building, is the fact itself. And then the interpretation, the language part of it is something else. And that these two things don't have to be connected or are not connected.
Can I provide an example?
Yeah, yeah.
The international style was basically stripped architecture of all its humanity and attempted to make a universal architecture that everybody recognized and appreciated. And what happened is nobody really appreciated it. So what happens is instead of trying to find the language of architecture, we find the language of the American people. We find the language of the Pueblos. We find the language of Islam. These are languages, architecture is not. It's just a tool to pass these languages on and express them to other people.
But aren't you treating architecture as if it's like this kind of natural growth, like this thing, this object outside of human influence, when in fact humans directly influence, if not at the basic level of the program, but also what kinds of symbolic dimensions they'd like for it to have?
I would say if you're going to say that the influence of mankind on architecture is a prerequisite for it to be a language, and that means everything in nature has been affected by mankind. There is nothing on this planet that hasn't been affected by us. Now, if we go to another planet and it's been occupied by aliens, does it cease to be pure? We have no idea if it's been occupied or not. Maybe a past generation of humankind that was smarter and more intelligent than us have already left this planet. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. But the awareness of that, does that mean it's language or not language? It doesn't matter. We're forcing language on things that don't have a language.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, the statement that you guys are answering is about semiotics as a design approach. So I've heard both of you talking about semiotics in general and architecture, but I'd like each side to answer more specifically how semiotics is or is not a design approach.
Well, understanding of the built environment to all time before you is an essential tool in understanding what it is that you can do and cannot do today. What's going to pass, what's going to fail, what's going to last, and what's going to deteriorate. It's not an issue of just repeating, it's understanding how these forms and these figures have come about and how they've communicated meaning throughout time and how it is that you can use those words, those issues, those meanings again in a new and creative way that expresses something about this time, this place.
I think as a specific example, with the statement itself, saying that it's a valid method of design approach. I think of one of the buildings that we looked at in Chicago, a bank. And a bank wants to be stable, it wants to communicate that it can be trusted with your money, essentially. And so part of the design process of developing that bank was to make it appear as a strong, firm, solid building, as something that will exist, something that will be there for a long time. And so as a method of communicating that to the public, even though the construction was used with steel and not with huge masonry blocks, as it happened historically, they used that language, that existing understanding of mass to create that bank to make it look like it was solid. And so even though we may have different interpretations, that building was designed with the intent to exhibit longevity and a firm foundation. And so essentially with that bank, what it was communicating is that we're strong, we're here, we will exist, we'll be here forever, essentially, even though it won't be there forever, but that's what they were trying to communicate. And so I think in the specific example, just looking at banks, that they want to communicate that. And so that is part of the design process to determine how you can communicate something that'll be solid, something that's firm that'll last.
What about the negative side? How would you respond?
We're saying that it's an inadequate design approach, but can act as something to critically analyze after the fact. But because of the change in society and the constant differences one faces, you can't use it as a design approach.
But if you
It's
can't,
simply syncretic in nature. And syncretic means of one time of one moment. So you freeze it in time, then you analyze everything around it, and yeah, it can be applicable. But if you take the diachronic approach, it doesn't really work. It just fails. And semiotics has pretty much been abandoned by most of the arts in general from my reading. And so it's not really considered a viable, discipline at this point. And I would like to point out just one, this is a philosophical notion. When does this become architecture? I just drew Star of David on there. Everybody knows what that means, right? It's the symbol, it's a primary Jewish symbol. Is this architecture when it's written on a piece of paper? Or when it becomes a sticker? Or when it's made out of wood? Or if it becomes, something put over a door frame? Or if it becomes the door itself? Or when it becomes the organization of a building? This is a symbol. This is not architecture.
Yeah, but
And symbol is separate from architecture. Architecture uses symbology to create, but itself is not a language.
So your response sounds very similar to the debate last week on typology. So, and then again, I guess, I'd like to hear from both sides, but does semiotics and typology relate to each other? Are they different? And then, also like in the design approach type of mentality with that. So I don't know who wants to
Yes?
The inherent problem with either or any system is when it's not investigated fully. So either typology or semiotics
How can
or
you investigate it fully if every interpreter has a different sense and experience of an architecture?
well, what we're not trying to do is not to speak to everyone in the world. The item itself is going to be read and interpreted in its own way, but that doesn't mean that we can't speak, that we can't communicate. The fact, there's a pretty well-known quote, the fact that any communication happening at all is a fallacy. So even the fact that I'm speaking to you now is only you reading it and interpreting it through your own framework and your own structure. That does not mean that we should not engage in communication to relay messages and information to one another.
So on the affirmative side, you're saying that it's not a zero-sum game. We can have partial levels of communication as long as that works, semiotics is okay. And on the other side, you're saying that semiotics is really about symbols. And architecture as a medium is something else. And that understanding the distinction between that is really a very important thing when you start to engage yourself as a designer.
I don't think architecture has to say anything, but symbols can be placed on architecture to convey a message, but that's not the architecture.
Okay, so we have a couple other hands. I want to get them to engage. You had your hand up first, then you. So let's let him go first, because he's been waiting for quite a bit of time, and then we'll let you ask your question.
All right, so this is more directed towards the negative standpoint. I do agree that a sign, and you can interpret it in architecture however you want, can be interpreted in multiple different ways. But don't you think the analysis of how architectural semiotics has changed throughout time, specifically the change in narrative of modernist architecture, when it went from Europe and the political views and everything and social cues in Europe to the United States, don't you think that analysis can be beneficial in shaping your architecture and be beneficial to your design process?
I'm saying you can use symbology, absolutely. You can use literature, you can use music, you can use any form of human expression. But architecture stands outside of symbology. It doesn't have to represent anything, it can still be meaningful. You can look at architecture and have no clue what it is. And you can derive your own meaning when it intended none. As an architect, as a designer, you can just make something beautiful. And that beauty might have nothing. You may be just completely mindless. You may throw stuff on the ground. And just the way it falls onto the ground, people can derive meaning from that. And architecture is the built environment, basically, is pretty much anything that houses people. And so therefore, doesn't necessarily have to convey a message.
So I hear you saying that autonomy presents architects with a radical freedom from having to communicate something. And that in an autonomous discourse or debate, that architecture no longer has to have meaning, and therefore it may not anymore have to be thought of as a language system.
And furthermore, he said just earlier that he said, I'm not trying to communicate to everybody. That's the point. You're taking Islamic symbology, Christian symbology, and we're creating that to speak to these people. But the idea that architecture is a universal language doesn't exist. I mean, and Colin Rowe presented a brilliant idea with the ideal of the mathematics of the ideal villa. It's a great idea, but you can't apply that to every villa. There is no universal. We picked two of them that happen to be similar, and he found two things that are similar, pointed out their similarities, but you can't take his rules and apply it to every villa on the planet, so you have to build it like this. It's not universal. It's very specific. And it's meant to talk to one person, or 2 people, or 5 people.
Okay, so let's get the next question, you and then you. Okay.
You go, because mine kind of deviated.
You said that if you just threw something on the ground and anybody can, derive meaning from it in whichever way they want, but that's still communicating, right? I mean, the architect may not have wanted to communicate, but as long as it is conveying a meaning, it is communicating.
All right, so if you walked in the woods and you saw some sticks lying on the ground that wasn't touched by man, and it just happened to form a symbol that you recognize, was that intentional? Are you forcing meaning on something that was arbitrary?
But is architecture arbitrary?
Well, that's a whole philosophical debate right there. We arbitrary.
No, but then the fact that I'm assigning a meaning to it means it's communicating something to
It's not telling you anything. You're forcing a meaning on it. The tree's not trying to tell you to be Jewish because it fell branches on the ground in a symbol. If a tree grows branches like this, it's not saying love Jesus. It's not trying to tell you that. There's no intent in communication. You're forcing a meaning on it because humans are in dire need of meaning in life. And a lot of it comes from our own insecurity. A lot of it comes from our uselessness. What's our purpose in this world? So we force meaning on things to basically derive meaning ourselves. But the tree's not trying to tell us something by looking like a cross.
So if the purpose of architecture is no longer to communicate meaning, then what do you think the purpose is? Like how should the designer think of his or her task as they enter the design process?
Well, I'm saying that architecture is the idea of pursuing it as universal language is, I think, ridiculous. To use symbology in your architecture, to use the symbology of a person, of a race, of a sect, I think is very valid. But it's not the language of architecture you're using. It's a language of symbols, a language of a sect, a language of a religion. That's what's important here. It's separate from architecture. So architecture is a medium used to employ symbols.
Right. So let's say like I'm not that kind of person, right? I'm an atheist. I don't have a particular belief system, but I want to be an architect, right? So if my job isn't to create or communicate, create a form that communicates a specific meaning to the public, then what is my job then as a designer as I go into the building?
To create something you find interesting.
So
I'm saying
it's like a
you can.
personal thing.
It's very personal.
Uh-huh.
And I think, honestly, the architecture I like the best is the architecture, to me, that feels honest. When you talk to someone, an honest person is much more relevant than someone who knows a lot of information. Because when you talk to someone who's honest and transparent, they engage you in a different way than someone who's spouting off facts. So when you look at architecture, I think it should come from yourself, from your own personal experiences. And that, to me, is true design. Because it's honest, and it says something about you, and it says something about who you are, not what you suppose people to be.
So I want to ask the other side too, the affirmative side. So what is it that you think, or how does this, your frame on this topic, how would you frame that response to someone? So let's say I'm a person, I want to design a building, but what is my primary task as a designer as I move into the design process?
We're saying that any mode of human creation is a method of communication, whether it be a jacket and a pair of slacks, or a pair of glasses and a button-down shirt. Architecture has in itself a means of communication that extends beyond the limitations of those other objects. And that's where the language of architecture stands apart aside from others. Other than that, it is first of the arts, which is a term that's been used throughout as long as people have been writing history. Therefore, it is part of the arts, which is another mode and mean of communication of sensation itself.
So you're saying, if I have you correct, that whether you're a believer in some system or not, the very fact that you're human and the very fact that you're creating an art form means that you are attempting to communicate. That there's some embedded in it, essentially, that art is about communication, whether it's just to oneself or to a larger public, and therefore semiotics or semiology is a valid approach because that's literally the human condition. So whenever you put two things together, whenever you make art, you are communicating something, and therefore semiology is valid.
Yes.
And I think one thing that Jack mentioned before, you were saying how you'd rather talk to an honest person. Well, how do you know if they're honest if you're not communicating with them? It doesn't have to be verbally, it could be visually, but you're communicating, and that's how you know that they're honest. And you're also talking about something that you are interpreting even if it didn't have meaning. You see a tree, if it left branches on the ground. I think that's one of the things that Bonta talked about. He said that there are indicators and signals, and some are intentionally left by the architect and some are not. But he pointed out that language and he talked about the omnipresence of meaning in architecture. Whether we intend it to be there or not, it exists. And I think we're arguing that it exists, but that it's a valid approach because it's inherent, whether we intend to communicate that the rose is a loving gesture or we intend it to indicate it's something else. It inherently communicates.
But the question here is not about communication. I'm not saying that there's no such thing as symbols. I'm not saying there's no such thing as communication. I'm not even getting close to that. What I'm saying is objects don't communicate. And architecture is a building, and a building may or may not communicate, but ultimately, we derive our own meaning in our own way. And we are told what things mean. And this meaning is ingrained in us and taught to us at a young age.
So I'm hearing a radical sense of autonomy in the negative position, that we need to look at architecture not the way that we've looked at it in the humanist age, as emerging from or inherently connected to the human condition, but that we can look at it in terms of its own materiality, in terms of its own facticity and objecthood, and that presents other opportunities for interpretation.
Can I attack the other side real quick?
Yeah.
The whole idea of architecture as a language to me is a very arrogant one. And this arrogance is basically saying, I'm right, I speak the language of architecture. If you speak the language of architecture, then everybody that disagrees with you is wrong. Because you know the language of architecture. And you see a lot of like Eisenman and some of this stuff, their language comes across really strong, I'm right, everybody else is wrong. This is the new language of architecture. Corb uses science, I'm using science, so therefore I'm right. But language is not a science, it's not a formula. It's a beautiful thing, it's an experience. And this experience isn't a science, it's something that's felt.
The misapplication of an instance or a tool doesn't discredit the tool itself.
I'm saying there's no universal applications of anything.
Why does it have to be universal?
Because that's what this is all about. The language of architecture implies that there's a universal language.
So
And architecture itself is speaking to us one voice, one interpretation. And that this ideal villa that exists in space, somehow, if we tap into this formula that we're all seeking out, then we're the perfect architect.
Okay, so we have 2 questions here. I want to get, okay, we have more than 2 questions. I want to get you here because you've been what you had for a while.
I got a little confused about what is your definition about semiotics? Because you are giving us a broad definition, you are giving us just communication, but what I get from semiotics is communication through symbols. And you are saying that any communication is semiotic.
Yes, because any communication is an organization of symbols arranged in a manner to convey an idea or information. So semiotics, that's the reason why semiotics has found its way into painting and photography and sculpture and architecture and fashion, because these things are a mode of communication, which is what semiotics is, the study of communication.
But if you're not speaking the same language, how are you communicating?
Because it speaks to something more broader than just our specific individual points.
So
But
you're
No.
you are saying that every communication have symbols, but I think we are using symbols that exist if we are going to use semiotic approach. And if this is going to be, every communication going to use any symbols, so they are not, I mean that they are not already symbols. After the creation, going to be symbols, you know? As Paul said, we have a building. It's going to be created anyway, and we don't know the language. After it exists, after we analyze that building, we are going to know about the symbolic way of that building, and we are going to use it in our other buildings if we are going to use it. So, I mean, how semiotic going to be the approach when that symbol doesn't exist?
We have to understand how that symbol is different compared to the other symbols that we already know and understand. And that's the reason why specific pieces of architecture and art exists longer than their cultures and their creation is because we see in them a difference from the standard, from the rest of symbols. So then we have to understand how that relationship is. What's different about that relationship that makes it unique?
You're talking about analyze. Analyze.
Yes, you have to use
Not
semiotics to
in the
analyze.
creation of it.
Analyzing
on both
requires a
sides.
past condition.
Yeah, you're
Analyzing cannot be in a current
Yeah,
condition.
she's asking, this is a really important question, right? So she's asking, when does a piece of architecture become a symbol, right? So, for example, in one of the opening statements, there was the illustration of the cave. And that it really wasn't understood as a symbol until you had 2 to 3 of them. And then through the comparison, the emergence of commonality, you now have a symbol that has an accrued meaning. And I think what she's asking is that, is there ever a time in the design process when you have something that isn't yet a symbol? And if that's the case, then how does semiotics help you design that object?
The cave doesn't become a symbol until it's inhabited, until it's used and understood for its function. Then it becomes a symbol, once you understand that there are multiple of these things and how this one is different from the rest.
So once you design it, it becomes a symbol.
Yes. So it
you can't
depends
design
on when
with
does it become architecture. I guess if you talk to Livius Woods, it's when the ink leaves his pen.
The question isn't does an architectural symbolize. The question more to me is can we recognize beauty without it meaning, becoming from a symbolic meaning? Can we look at a mountain and see it as beautiful and appreciate it without it meaning something to us, without it trying to tell us something? Can architecture be experienced without having some sort of secret hidden message and agenda as we walk through the building and it tells us, you know, agree with Hitler, let's kill all the everybody else? I mean, is architecture forcing its language on us? Architecture of Happiness, we all read it during the summer term, or the M2 people. It brought up, can a building, you can't force any type of moral code on us. Because the symbology is not necessary for appreciation.
So we have time for one more question in the front here.
Actually, I have many, but I'll just ask you. You said
Choose your best one. Choose your best one. We need to get closing question.
Your Jack question, 5 questions in one.
You said, can't we just experience architecture? What do you mean by experiencing? Isn't that kind of communicating, but not probably to the whole thing, but probably to you? Even that is kind of a communication. So I just wanted to ask you if you feel architecture cannot be a language, or if you mean architecture cannot be a universal language, because architecture has to be a language. It communicates. Even that bottle communicates. Objects do communicate individually. So what are you trying to say when you say experience it? Isn't that a kind of a communication?
The problem is to communicate, there's a criteria that has to be satisfied. 1, you have to have a sender, and 2, you have to have a receiver. If you're a receiver and there's nobody sending, then it's not communication. Which is why people walk into the mountains and experience God, or whatever, Buddha, Islam, everything you could possibly experience. They derive some healing from their parents. They're receiving something, but there is no one communicating to them. So man's solution to that was, it's God. God's trying to communicate to me. So therefore, are we saying architecture is God? And that was why the statement was included earlier. You don't have, if there's not a sender, it's not communication. So therefore, we can derive meaning without a sender.
So unfortunately, we've reached our time limit. We have to allow for closing statements. And as I was timing you in the beginning, you went beyond your 5 minutes. So I encourage you to stick to your 5-minute frame so that there's enough time to collect things and tally. So again, we're going to start with the affirmative argument that semiotics is an appropriate approach to design because architecture is a language of form. And you guys will have 5 minutes to wrap up, and then we will let the negative side offer their closing statements as well.
Art preserves, and it is the only thing in the world that is preserved. It preserves and is preserved in itself. Although actually it lasts no longer than its supports and materials, stone, canvas, chemical color, and so forth. The young girl maintains the pose that she has had for 5,000 years, a gesture that no longer depends on whoever made it. The thing became independent of its model from the start. but it also is independent of other possible personae who are themselves creations. It is no less independent of the viewer or hearer who experience it after, if they have the strength for it. What is preserved, the thing or the work of art, is a block of sensation, which is the compound of percept and affect. Art is the language of sensations. Art does not have opinions. Art undoes the opinions of the creator and posits an aggregate of sensations in the viewer that take the place of language. An architecture that is posited in an attempt to express an opinion is only capable when both the viewer and creator share the archive of information. The sensations within the work exist beyond the limitations of a singular archive. They speak to the percepts of all lived experiences and refer us to the archive of humanity itself. The significance of a column is not in the styling or the ornament, but in the existence of the column itself. Each setting has engendered a grammatical style, a shaping and molding of connotation and denotation within their own networks and modes of communication that has been borrowed, improved, and bastardized from another. Many a theorist have studied and labored over the possibilities. I believe that Clarence Brown assessed it best in his critical essay, The Noise of the Time, the prose of Ossip Mandelstam, when he stated, "Over my head and over the head of many of my contemporaries there hangs a congenial tongue tie. We were not taught to speak but to babble, and only by listening to the swelling noise that aged and bleached by the foam of the crest of its wave did we acquire a language." It is this awareness of a critical engagement of language that opened the possibility for understanding and assessment of the status quo. Understanding the rules and their origins illuminates the fissures in an unyielding system and the possibility of creation. Rather than repeat the past and continue to babble, we can assess the structures of information, critically engage the information and sensations of the past, and legitimately give birth to our own time and place. It does not matter if the modern's applique of stucco over masonry or Augustus's veneering of the brick city and marble is the same and the meaning of the same. To present the old as new and improved, to stimulate pride among the viewers. Meaning is dependent on specific context, conventions, or simple accidents. For that reason, meanings are often unstable in their shelf life, or as Jinx states, the frontiers of meaning are always momentarily in a state of collapse and paradox. We must look beyond the superficial and critically examine the depths. Art is the presentation of sensations, not the representation of language. Therefore, these sensations are not within the language of another, but within the language of those who experience it, if they have the strength for it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Architecture doesn't require understanding of the symbols employed to be appreciated.
And architecture can communicate, but it doesn't have to. It just is. Therefore, it must hold separate to its communication. Architecture isn't meant to be read, but experienced. Susan Hayward states, structuralist semiotics can lead to a crushing of the aesthetic response through the weight of the theoretical framework. Architecture is not a science, but an art. The human experience has yet to be predicted by science, and the appreciation of beauty does not require calculation. Semiotics has attempted to be the science of all sources of meaning. John Strock states, the dramatic extension of the semiotic field to include the whole of culture is looked on by those suspicious of it as a kind of intellectual terrorism, overfilling our lives with meanings. That is not to say that architecture lacks meaning, but that that meaning cannot be predetermined absolutely nor forced on its receiver. Man derives meaning from everything, and individual interpretation is often an exploration of possibility. That interpretation can be influenced by a global event as viewed on the news, or a personal event via a loved one, a good book, or simply to play devil's advocate after hearing a peer's review.
Paul Maceris, a specialist in multimedia, points out, to a substantial degree, the formal conventions encountered in still or motion pictures should make a good deal of sense, even to first-time viewers. Palmaseris essentially argues that we don't need to learn to read the code of photographic or audiovisual media. The similarities between the image and the reality, between the sign and the signifier, is not merely a matter of cultural convention. Is architecture any less visible? Architecture does not require an interpreter. Architecture is and does not need further explanation. Finally, semiotics is not, never has been, and seems unlikely ever to be an academic discipline in its own right. It is now widely regarded primarily as one mode of analysis, amongst others, rather than a science of cultural forms.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, just to make sure, because I was confused, and that kind of touches on her question. So, are you saying that architecture that uses semiotics, but does not translate to everybody at the same time? Or, and that kind of is a question for you. Are you saying that architecture translates through semiotics to many other people at the same time? Because I'm confused about that part.
Semiotics is just a mode of analysis, like content analysis.
And you're
There's
saying
lots
that-
of
okay.
lots of ways to analyze the world. There's just one
It doesn't
mode.
play any role in architecture.
It does.
No, it does. It's a great tool of
For
analysis.
analysis, not
But
design.
analysis is a priority knowledge, or sorry, it has to be observed. It has to already happen. If you're employing it in design, I mean, there's what the idea that architecture is one language is a ridiculous one. And if it's not one language, then it must be a tool employed by language systems, by symbolic systems, and we employ architecture to communicate with our employed systems. But it itself is not a system on its own. That's why no one can understand architecture universally.
And what about the affirmative side?
Yes, architecture is a mode of communication that semiotics can help us understand and analyze the modes and means of those communications.
But it does not have to translate to many different people and cultures at the same time.
It doesn't have to have a specific meaning to every single
Okay.
individual, no.
Okay.
What about using it as a tool for design? I mean, is that possible?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Charles, will you open this back up to Q&A?
So what I want to do is I want to have you guys now mark your papers in terms of where you are now. So we asked you to assess your position before the debate. And now we're at the end of the debate. And these are the two positions that you are gauging in your mind. On the affirmative side is the notion that semiotics is an appropriate metaphor for architectural design. And on the negative side, semiotics is not an appropriate metaphor for architectural design. So if you mark affirmative, you're marking for is. If you're marking the negative, you're marking is not.
Can you define metaphor?
Metaphor? That is a whole other class. If you would like, instead, think of it as just a process for design, right? Okay.
I just write down the name of the group.
The name of the group?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Scott Barber and William Glen argued for the affirmative, and Calum Dodson and Michael James argued for the negative. Yeah, it's probably bad. Yeah, really? It was a spirit of debate. Would you like that? Rolling a hashish in class?
What?
Man, this is
If you're not
semiotics.
stressed, bro.
So are you guys entertained? Let's get ready to rumble!
Add my paper back, I'd like to.
Yes, sir. Did you get your flash drive?
So do I have all the papers? Okay, so I'm going to tally really quickly, and hopefully less than 10 minutes, and then we'll have a decision.
It doesn't matter, we're all winners.
They're all special snow days.
We all winners for being here today.
We're all
Snowflake. Now that's a benefit. You're all snowflakes, that's a benefit.
We can talk to school about it.
Feel better?
Highly
Need a sticker?
unique. The only thing that we have in common is difference.
You're starting to act like
There's gonna be a lot of neutrals, I think.
Well, that was heated, man.
I think that's, everybody's like, you probably thought one side, you're not sure about the side.
Yeah.
So you have both different universe.
Yeah, you got both things out of the way today. Stressful day. Matt, am I already making sense?
Yes.
I think it did, but it didn't change it.
That's fine. No, all I cared about was my opinion was portrayed accurately.
No, it makes sense.
Because I had to pick a side. It's not like I agree with my side and disagree with my side. You have no idea.
Yeah, you have to stand with your.
I wanted to bring a personal thing. By the way, I think the general approach of critiques would disagree with semiotics. Because the one thing I'm criticizing every review is you over-explain everything. You're driving too much meaning from your project. And so therefore there's this natural desire not to explain everything. So therefore,
You can only use it to analyze the building. It's not, you can't do it in a current,
but then where does it stop? Do you stop at the facade? Do you stop at the internal structure? Do you stop at the way you put the screws in? Where's the point?
I don't think you can separate
The way the screws put in the wall?
from meaning.
But some things are
but it's not one meaning.
Unless you're a rim pool house, you don't care if all the screws are lined up in the same direction, which means they're leaving it arbitrariness. So it's not intended to communicate anything the way the screws are set up. The rim pool house took another approach when he did UVA, not UVA, that was Chicago, and he wanted all the screws to be lined up. Remember how they carefully all the screws are lined up? Most architects think that's arbitrary because it's not intended to communicate. So it ceases to be architecture. How much of it has to be intended to communicate? So there's so many things I talk about.
It's communicating something different to every individual in this meeting, so therefore there's no language to define them with. You can only use it as an analysis.
I agree with that. So if the architect is not trying to communicate, if you derive meaning, that's not communication. Because you have to have a receiver. Communicate requires two parties. And deriving meaning from things has nothing to do with communication. But the question is not if he's trying to convey meaning. The question is, does it cease to be architecture if it doesn't? So how much of the building has to be communication and how much is random?
So from the beginning of class, when you guys voted before there was a debate, 23 people agreed with the affirmative position that semiotics is an appropriate metaphor or an approach to architecture design. 5 people had no opinion, and 7 people were of the negative opinion that semiotics is not an appropriate metaphor and approach to design. At the end of the debate, we had 22 people believing in the affirmative position, 2 people in the negative, and 2 people of no opinion, and 10 people in the negative. So in terms of overall numbers, the affirmative wins the debate. But in terms of changing the most minds, the negative actually picked up the side. So an interesting dynamic that's there. I'll post these results online, and now that we have 2 videos, full videos of of the debates that will also go online as a podcast. So before we leave, let's just give a round of applause to everybody for this. We look forward to our next week's discussion.
I did my
The
my
one
goal.
situation where that's an accurate
Do we get
statement.
fees? Do we get fees for this? Oh my God.
Your A's and B's are not based on a popular vote.